This is the Strike Mash Boil podcast, presented by the Merrimack Valley Homebrew Club. This week we talk about beer for people who don't like the taste of beer. And Mr. Lactose is here to tell us where to get started with using lactose in your brew. That and more, so stay tuned.
Welcome back to Strike Mash Boil. I'm Marco, president of Merrimack Valley Homebrew Club, and I'm joined by my co-host, Phil.
Thanks, Marco. First up, this is the 9th show we've released, and we've been out in the world for 8 whole weeks. For those of you who are listening, thank you. We hope you've enjoyed the show, and if you haven't yet, leave us a review, leave us a comment, hit us with a rating out there on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever it is that you listen to us. And if you do have questions or thoughts for us, hit us up on social media, on Instagram at Strike Mash Boil. Hit us up in our Facebook group, facebook.com/group/MVHBC. Hit us up with questions. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, like Phil said, if you like us, leave us a review. If you don't, just keep on walking. So we've got a lot to talk about, guys. First up is our usual roundtable. Then we have a twist on beer judging segment. And lastly, we're going to dig into using lactose in the beer.
Yeah, so let's jump right into it. And joining us for the first time on the show is Mr. Lactose himself, Joe. Joe, welcome to the show.
What's going on, guys?
And we've got the doc back with us too. Nick, welcome, bud.
Hello.
Yeah, so since this is Joe's first show, let's hit him with those quick fire questions, get to know him a little bit. I'll ask a question. Joe, give us the first thing that pops into your head for a response. Favorite beer style?
IPA.
Least favorite beer style?
ESBs.
Favorite beer ingredient?
Hops.
Least favorite?
Pass.
Pass. All right. What piece of brewing equipment could you not live without?
Digital thermometer.
What piece of brewing equipment do you think is overrated?
Iodine strips.
That's a new one. Yeah.
Yeah, seriously.
What's your dream piece of brewing equipment with money not a factor?
Oh, the Spike Nano system, that one barrel, $16,000 piece of equipment right there.
We might have a member that's going to have to earmuff that portion. Like, you're not allowed to brew on that system anymore, Joe.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. What beer topic, subject, style do you wish would go away?
Saying that traditional techniques of brewing that actually work have no significance.
Oh, interesting.
Who the hell's talking about that?
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know.
What's your desert island beer?
Notch Session Pills.
When you are not in the mood for a beer, what is your go-to cocktail?
White Russians, for sure, just like the dude.
Listen, Joe just threw me all kinds of fucking whacked on that quick fire. How is he Mr. Lactose and his favorite beer ingredient's not lactose? Like, somebody help me out with that.
I don't use it that much.
Yeah, sure you don't.
All right, well, I guess it's time for us to get into a bit of a rant. And guys, today we're going to talk about something that might be a little bit controversial. And it's, you guys have heard me say this before on the show, but beer for people who don't like the taste of beer. So we're wanting to talk about this for a while with both Nick, our national BJCP judge, and our resident Haze boy, Joe, who absolutely loves these trends that are out there. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And when I say beer for people who don't like the taste of beer, I'm talking about the use of techniques and ingredients to such an extreme that the result is only how the beer is made and not actually what it tastes like. They're adding things to such extent that it's making things taste like desserts or fruits, or mimicking pastries and really sweet beverages. So over the holidays, we saw a ton of beers that really came out in social media and advertisement, and our club shared it a lot on some of our Zoom meetings and our social media page. One of which was Lord Hobo releasing their orange creamsicle ale. Another one, which drives me up a fucking wall, was Armadillo Ale Works did a cranberry sauce beer, which literally pouring it out of the damn can was jelly.
They had to cut they had to use a can opener to cut the lid off.
I thought it was a joke and they were being serious. We also saw
it was so serious, Marco. It was $19 a 4-pack.
Yeah, for jelly.
For jelly.
alcoholic jelly is what that was. And then we also had some folks that were basically putting milkshakes in cans. So a lot of really interesting, crazy stuff going on. So I want to get your guys' take. What do you guys think about just the trends in general with people creating these off-the-wall beers that are just not designed to taste like beer?
Honestly, I love these styles of beer. I got a sweet tooth. Always love all kinds of desserts, tiramisu. If I can get those flavors in a beer as such as a dessert, where I don't have to be eating the food and drinking a beer side by side, I love bringing them together. I also think it's a great segue, I think, or gateway. So people who don't love standard styles of beer, maybe, or don't even drink much beer. It's getting them in the door of a brewery or getting them to start buying beer from a specific brewery and finding out later on that they tried different styles from that same brewery, that they do actually like beer and the taste of beer. So it can really help bring business to these breweries and keep that going, because right now breweries are hurting really bad. So they're trying to figure out any way to get somebody in the door, having these over-the-top styles of fruit and pastry stouts to get people who normally maybe not buy beer to buy beer. And I think that marketing people have been doing that for hundreds of years. Think about, say, German brewers were coming to the United States producing really crisp lagers, and American brewers were having IPAs, porters, and stouts, and people wanted these crisper beers. The American brewers had to come up with something, and thus we got cream ale. So I think being able to pivot and change, meet demand, and change with the market is something that I think is definitely helping. I don't know. I love it. I think we just keep going in this direction. Sometimes you can go off the edge. I don't think there's any need to be putting Jello shots into a can, but I think the style itself, when done properly, can taste great and then lead to other beers that could be similar, or people loving that same brewery, or getting into new styles.
Well, I mean, I'm ready to pounce here, but I got to hear what Nick says first, because Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm clearly the oldest person on this podcast right now, so my views are, I can appreciate the different kind of outside the boundaries experimentation that people do with many of these beer styles. Some of them are interesting. I find a lot of them are gimmicks and just a way to kind of put the brewery out there, almost like they're posting it just on social media, and the beer itself isn't really serious. It's just kind of just a marketing ploy. But there's also a lot of different styles nowadays that are super popular amongst mostly younger people that, Americans, we love our sweet things, right? So many of these beers, whether it's the fruited Berliners, whether it's the milkshake beers, whether it's the pastry stouts, at the end of the day, they're all sweet, right? I mean, every single one of these styles are sweet, and it's what people want. And I guess my problem with it is there's such a concentration of these breweries that this is all they do. This is all they brew, is these styles. And as someone who likes, beer, but what I mean by that, I think that needs to be defined, because beer obviously encompasses many different styles. Beer to me is a combination of hops, malt, and sometimes a yeast profile, whether it's esters or phenolics or whatnot, or sometimes it isn't, but generally malts and hops. And
you dropping the German beer law on us right now?
No. See, I don't mind different adjuncts. I guess my point is that to me is beer. And so when you taste like a pastry stout, you're not really tasting the malt anymore, right? I mean, you're just tasting whatever adjuncts are thrown in there, whatever sweetness. When you're tasting a sweet Berliner Weiss or milkshake beer, you're no longer tasting the hops, right? The hops are secondary. Maybe they're in there to add some fruity notes, but at the end of the day, they're hiding it. So what all these different styles are doing is they're just hiding the main components of the beer itself. And that's why we talk about beer for people who don't like beer. That's what these are designed for. And I think Joe has a good point that they do bring new people into the fold. My counter would be, fuck those people. I don't really want new people. because all it means is that I can't get a Pilsner at my favorite brewery because their tanks are full of Berliners and milkshake beers, milkshake IPAs. Or I can't get, to hit on Joe, I can't get an ESB because, they have 8 pastry stouts on tap at the time. So I don't know. It just, the beer world, there's so many great styles that exist. And I just feel like nowadays, a lot of these kind of new breweries are just brewing 20 different versions of the same pastry stout, the same base, just throwing as much whatever sweet adjuncts, dessert shit they can throw in there and selling it. And I just find it really boring. And honestly, many of these beers, I can't drink more than a few ounces of it. I mean, yeah, it tastes good for a couple of ounces, but it's the same reason why I like having like a cookie. I don't enjoy eating 80 cookies, which is like a 22-ounce thing of pastry stout. So I don't know. It's tough. It's tough to kind of to reconcile it. I can recognize it and have respect for it, but I do kind of miss the more variety of styles that are out there.
So there's this local brewery here. They got 24 taps on the wall, and I've gone in there pre-COVID, and they would have 10 or 12 IPAs, and then the rest were all fruited sours or milkshake IPAs or pastry stouts or imperial stouts. There were no other beer styles. You got 24 beers, and you basically just dropped down into 4 categories. And like you were saying, Nick, you can't go into a bar and just get, shit, I just want a good Pilsner, or I just want, ESB. That's a little tough around here. I mean, as much of a English beer lover as I am, I'm not going to find one of those here. But, there's all kinds of other beer styles out there. And if you got 24 draft lines, what the hell are you doing it with filling it up with 4 styles that you basically do iterations of the same thing? And
but is it their fault or the consumer's fault?
Well, it's absolutely the consumer. They're going where the money is. I can't blame those guys for doing that.
So yes and no, right? There's an important distinction to make in what we're talking about, because we're not talking about a standard New England IPA, which a standard New England IPA to me is still a beer, right? Really hop forward, great body, taste the malt, relatively balanced. But that's not what these guys are brewing anymore. I mean, they're brewing things that the hop characteristics that they're adding, the amount of hops that they're using to get characteristics that don't taste anything like natural hops taste like. And they're adding adjuncts like vanilla or lactose, or they're adding different fruits to it. They're literally creating something that isn't a beer, even remotely close to a beer. To what Joe was talking about earlier, which is to get people in the door, there's not any of the breweries that are really focused on, like Night Shift you were talking about a second ago, that has half their taps dedicated to these extreme beers. They're not doing it to try to introduce somebody to their badass Pilsner that they're making, which Night Shift doesn't make a badass Pilsner, but they're not doing that because there isn't any options there for it. They're not trying to bring somebody in that's going to jump on the wagon of some of these great beers. The breweries that you'll see do that are like Sylvaticus. Like you'll go into Sylvaticus and you'll see a New England IPA, and then they'll have a bunch of other beers. So they're using it because they know.
Sylvaticus Notch is another one that does the same thing.
They know that if you're going to have any shot at surviving as a brewery, you got to have a New England IPA, right? If you don't have a shot. It's not all New England IPA. So they're using it. Their tactic is bring somebody in the door with this style of beer that we know is going to be successful, and then hope that somebody gets that second beer that's going to be what my wheelhouse is, or what I'm wanting to showcase as my brewery. But again, it's still not these fucking crazy ass beers that are coming out there that aren't really beer that people are doing, that are diabetes in a can or a bottle.
I definitely agree with you there. There's one thing I think you need to strike is balance on the beer itself. You can be using these adjuncts, the fruit, lactose, and spices, but doing them in a balanced manner is going to make that beer enjoyable to a lot of people versus someone who just is into it because it's a fruit. You also need that same balance on your tap list. I like to keep it at my house. Like right now, I have one New England IPA. I have a Pilsner. I have a Belgian ale, I have a pastry stout, but I don't have usually more than one. And I like to keep that balance because sometimes I do want, a sweeter beer. I want a really crazy hoppy New England IPA, and then I want a really crisp Pilsner. So I think just keeping that balance is where they're not getting that balance. They're really just overloading it just to sell beer, which is unfortunate because, a lot of places probably can make really good classic styles, but they're just being forced by the market to make those beers, which is unfortunate. A real crisp Pilsner it's kind of few and far between out in the wild right now.
Well, and I guess the part that makes us a little sensitive to this is, in COVID times where we're seeing sort of the craft beer bubble burst a little bit, where we're seeing, a bunch of breweries close, they're struggling to stay open. And the ones that are struggling the most are the ones that have not adopted this extreme, crazy, stupid beer trend that to get out there. Like Mystic Brewing is an example that wasn't doing all these wacky beers and shuttered their doors, closed it down.
I would disagree with that. Right at the end there, not even the end, the last maybe year, Mystic Brewing was huge on New England IPAs, Milkshake IPAs. You went in there and half their draft list was
because they were getting
hipster beer.
Yeah, they were getting their asses kicked because of the Haze Boy hipsters that
probably
yeah, totally. And then so now what's shaking out is those guys that didn't do that sooner are now in a place where they're either having to do it themselves, probably much against what they'd want to do, or they're having to close because people are just going to these.
You have probably the most experimental brewers out there are home brewers, and we talked about that in previous shows, and we're going to talk about it a little with Joe later about lactose. So we're pretty experimental people, but we're the ones that are having a problem with all this experimenting. And I wonder if, maybe we as homebrewers having a problem with it, we are at the forefront of maybe a course correction in the industry. We're sick of it, and eventually other people are going to get sick of it as well. And you're already starting to see the Krispie Bois come out there who are looking for the pale lagers, which I think
I'm all into this Krispie Bois logo.
Yeah.
Like I'm in. Call me a Krispie Boy. I'm in on that.
That is definitely coming back. There are breweries that are throwing up the Pilsners and the Helles and Kolsch's because even though it's not a lager, but because that's what people want to drink as well. So maybe there is some course correction coming, and we're just at the peak of the adjunct bubble, as it were.
I hope so, but I really doubt it. As I mentioned, I'm all for experimentation, but when your experimentation is using the same super sweet base style and just throwing in different combinations of adjuncts, one with vanilla and one with cacao beans, one with just cacao only, one with cacao and coconut, one with vanilla and coconut, that's not experimentation at that point. You know what I mean? So I do hope that we do kind of move on from this sort of trend and more towards, lighter, drier, palatable beers. I mean, the Belgians, they have a lot of pride in beers that finish dry. So it makes you want to drink another one, and then so I hope that we're kind of moving in that direction.
The only other thing I would say is I tend to agree with Nick. I don't see it going away, and I only see the only way I see this sort of starting to figure itself out is two things. These experiments get to a point where these beers are just way too fucking expensive, and we're already getting close to that threshold where the cost of producing these beers is outrageous, and therefore the cost for the consumer to buy them is outrageous. The other part is for those that have seen these cans and stuff that have been exploding on people because of re-fermentation in the cans because they got so much fucking sugar in them. Somehow these breweries have gotten totally off the hook and haven't been held accountable to the standards of shelf-stable product. And people have had cans blow up on them, and how somebody hasn't gotten sued yet or gotten into significant trouble that there's been standards put in place, I have no idea, because when that standard comes in, I don't think they're going to be able to recreate what they are right now with processes that clean up and make sure these things are shelf stable. So guys, thanks. That was a lot of fun. I could do this for a lot longer. This is a topic that drives me a little mad, but I appreciate you guys taking some time and sharing your perspectives. Joe, you were a bit on an island there. Sorry that you were by yourself on that one. But thanks for thanks for being that lone haze boy voice for us, guys. Thanks again. Look forward to having some more discussions with you.
All right, time for this week's beer review. And we have a bit of a situation. Our submitter sent us his beer, and he doesn't know what category to put it in. He described the beer as a ruby red sour rested on raspberries. It's about an 8% ABV beer. The grist was Pils, Rye, Special B, Belgian biscuit, and he fermented it with Hill Farmstead, Jester King, and a bunch of other dregs of other random wild beers. He kind of described it as an oud bruin with rye, and he doesn't know if this fits into Wild Specialty Beer 28C or go into one of the categories in 29 for fruit beers, because this was rested on raspberries. So he's really looking for some help on how to submit this to a competition.
Well, now this is a different situation for us, right? We don't know the category. Instead, we're going to taste it and try to figure it out and help this guy out. So, hopefully they get some value out of what we're going to talk about. And thankfully, we've got the doc back with us to help us out. Nick, hope you're up for this challenge, kind of tasting things semi-blind and trying to figure it out. I hope you're ready for it.
I will try my best.
All right, so Nick, why don't you start off by just maybe giving us an idea of when he submitted the beer to us. He said he wasn't sure if it was 29 or 28. Maybe you could talk to us about what those categories are.
Sure. So just first off, it's pretty common for someone to have a beer that they think is really tasty and they want to enter the competition. And maybe it's not as straightforward as a pale ale or a stout, and they don't know what category to put it in. Because as you know, there are many categories in BJCP, and some are quite confusing. Categories 28, 29 are two pretty confusing categories overall. They encompass a pretty large umbrella of different sub-styles. Even reading the guidelines can be a little bit confusing. Category 28 is American Wild Ale, and it encompasses beers that are made with Brett only, and beers made with mixed cultures, beers made with mixed cultures with fruit or spices or herbs added in. So it's basically kind of umbrella of different kind of wild American beers. American beers with a certain base style that has been soured or has been hit with wild yeast. Category 29, on the other hand, are base beers with fruit, herbs, or spices added. Secondly, the category is fruit beer. 29A is fruit beer, 29B, fruit and spice beer, 29C, specialty fruit beer, where you can add a bunch of other stuff. The rule is, though, with fruit beer, if the beer is sour or has a mixed culture, you can't enter it in 29. That is reserved specifically for category 28. So if you just have another base style beer, say a blonde ale with strawberries, right, that would go in category 29. That's a fruit beer. If you had a beer that you put in some cinnamon stout, maybe, again, that could go. Actually, it wouldn't go. It would go into a different style. There's actually a spice beer, but you get the point. Any kind of clean beer, which is made with normal Saccharomyces yeast, would go into fruit beer category. Anything that has a mixed culture would go in category 28.
So that's exclusively the rule all the time, because people tend to blend these things together all the time. So we have an example here of a beer that is sour and has fruit in it, but that sour component's going to be the deciding factor of which category it goes into. But if it's a clean beer, you're going to then find what the additive is and place it into the category.
Yeah, it's important to recognize how it tastes, right? So you can say, let's say you went out and you tried to make a mixed ferm beer, but it didn't sour, right? It's not sour at all, but it has fruit in it. So it's a fruity beer, but it tastes pretty clean, even though you added all these dregs to it. You wouldn't add that into category 28. It would get destroyed because the judges aren't going to be able to detect that mixed ferm culture, right? You would actually want to submit that into the fruit beer category, even though you added all this other stuff to it, because at the end of the day, all that matters is what it tastes like. Okay, it doesn't matter what your plan was. So that's a really important distinction, because that happens a lot too. A lot of people, they brew what they think is a certain style. It turns out that it tastes nothing like that style, but they still enter it into that original style that they had in mind. And the beer doesn't judge very well, because at the end of the day, it's what the final product tastes like, not what you had on paper at the beginning. So it's very important to kind of understand that before you kind of figure out what category you're going to submit the beer into.
Yeah, really great point. I'm thinking about like some fruit that's hard to get fruit flavor into it, like, how much peach you have to use to get peach flavor in a beer. Like you might not have put enough. You might not be able to taste the peach. So then it doesn't show up in that category. Or there's a lot of exotic fruits that are being used nowadays in beer that might give some flavors that are, might be reminiscent of something sour, like passion fruit, or that you might taste it and say, wow, this is way more tart than I expected. So yeah, it's a really good point that I really haven't thought of before, because if I had a fruited sour beer, Lord knows I've probably done this before, taken my fruited sour and put it into the fruit specialty category because it's a fruit beer and I want people to taste the fruit, and the sour is just a secondary part of it. So that's something I'm learning today for sure.
In reading the guidelines, I can see how our submitter got confused, because in the guideline for 29C, it doesn't say the clean versus sour. It doesn't differentiate between the two, but it definitely does over on 28C for the wild, where it says, sour and fruit. So you really do have to look at both categories and read them back and forth against each other.
That actually happened to me as well. I submitted my beer into the fruit category, and I was lucky to get a response back from an organizer to let me know that I should probably be putting that into another category. It still didn't help me because I never specified a base style of the beer. So I got some information on my score sheets that were, letting me know everything about the beer, getting like good reviews, very clean. You could taste the fruit. It was a blueberry, raspberry, vanilla sour ale, but I didn't specify any base beer. So there was no smell of hops. That was kind of like a question that we can't smell hops. They didn't know what style of beer it was. So then ended up getting dinged on scores for that, regardless of the blueberry was there, the raspberry was there, the vanilla was there, the carbonation was there, everything was well-rounded in the beer. They didn't know what it was, so it was detrimental to the entire score.
Yeah, and Joe brings up a really good point, right? This is one of the 28 and 29 are one of the few examples of when you enter into a competition, you have to provide a little bit more information, because when you read the guidelines, it's saying like, depending on the base style, this is what it should taste like. Nick, will you remind everybody, like, what is it? What's usually the added info people have to provide when they're putting categories in, putting it into these categories?
Yeah, generally they need to know what the base beer is, because they sort of treat it as you're adulterating a base style with fruit or bugs or whatever. So many of these substyles do require including base style, and some even include what kind of fruit you're adding, depending on the substyle itself. I'm a little bit surprised by Joe's story, actually, just because nowadays, when everything's online, so you enter your entries online, usually that requirement comes up whenever you submit the beer in these substyles, and if you don't put what the base style is, you can't input the beer. So I don't know if how you had it or how you tried to enter it, but it's most of the times these days, the requirements will come up when you start entering it online. So
you mean during registration?
During registration, correct, for the competition, yeah. Because most competitions use the same software that's usually built in. So that helps. That usually helps a lot of people who don't want to spend the time to read all of the guidelines.
Right. What I think I got mixed up or screwed up on that one is I submitted it originally under the fruit ale category, which didn't require me to put that base style, and then I changed just the category and pretty much kind of glossed over the rest of it, and I possibly just put sour ale, which is not a style. So
yeah, I guess the registration will just take words, right? So it won't actually know if it's a style, or you're just saying what it is.
Yeah. I mean, it's not perfect by any means. But it can be confusing. But I mean, like these sort of styles, because it can get kind of confusing if when we judge, you're not judging the only thing you're blinded to. You're not blinded to the style, right? You're blinded to who entered the beer and who that individual is. But there's certain information that's really useful when you're judging beer, especially when you're trying to compare different beers, and knowing what the base style is, especially for sour beers that can have a ton of different flavors. Being able to distinguish flavors that are coming from the bugs and beers or flavors coming from the base styles is pretty important too, and that's why that's a requirement for these categories.
Well, we've let the submitter hang on long enough while we talked about how the hell to figure some of this out. Maybe we should taste this thing and provide some context. To recap a little bit, Phil had told us that the beer was a ruby red sour rested on raspberries. And it's not clear if the ruby red part is before the raspberries, because I'm looking at this thing and it's raspberry red, so it looks definitely a product of the raspberries, but maybe he was getting some decent red color before that. Added a little bit of context with the grain bills, got some pills, some rye, special B, Belgian biscuit malt in there, minor amount of hops, which makes sense for a sour beer. Let's dive in and Nick, talk us through how we can help this person fit it into a category for their next competition.
What's interesting is a lot of the information wouldn't be provided to a judge. So, for example, that malt bill wouldn't be provided to the judge. So let's just assume that I don't know that and I'm just tasting the beer. So right away, I mean, it tastes like it's a mixed culture, right? I mean, you get sort of the Brett character, the perceived sourness and the aroma. You also get quite a bit of fruit character too from the raspberries. And generally that will be indicated on the form, assuming it was put in either category 28 or category 29. So just based off of that, just based off the aroma alone, it'd probably be 28C, which is wild specialty beer. And this is sort of an umbrella sub-style that encompasses pretty much any kind of sour beer, mixed culture beer that can have fruit, spices, or whatever in it. So it covers a wide spectrum of different beers, and this would actually fall under it just based off of the aroma and the taste alone. Now, when you tell me about the malt bill, a little flashbulb went off of my head, because that malt bill is very reminiscent of sort of a Flanders red style, which I found really interesting. And I wonder if that was the original intention of the submitter of this beer. The one thing that would kind of push it away from Flanders red, obviously, is the raspberries. The raspberries, I think, are pretty prominent in the beer, and Flanders red beers are known to be very fruity. It shouldn't be like fruity. Fruity. It should be fruity in the terms of coming from the mixed culture or coming from the barrel character, which is also another characteristic of the style. But it's funny that you mentioned the malt bill, because that kind of went off in my head a little bit. But yeah, based off what I'm tasting, I would consider it 28C. So again, it's sour, so it can't be 29. It definitely has a mixed culture firm, so you get quite a bit of that barnyard Brett, but you also get tartness and sourness. And then I think the raspberries come out pretty well, to be quite honest, and that would make it a fruit beer. So those requirements, or those components, kind of make it fall under the 28C category.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually kind of fun to have a little bit more information when we're doing one of these things, because you don't really, like, I'm trying to put myself in the head of this brewer and say, like, wow, what were they trying to do? And to your point, probably knowing, not probably, you definitely know styles of beer a little bit more than I do. The rye malt, is a Flanders red typically have rye in it?
It doesn't, but like everything else you said. So the Pilsner, the Special B, you said something else.
Belgian
biscuit. But
those are common.
I'm curious, like what I'm trying to do is I'm putting myself in their shoes and say, all right, what are you trying to do with the rye? Like, I know what rye does to beers, but if you're going into it trying to create a sour beer and you're adding rye, you're looking for a spicy balance. Like, I'm not, it's just an interesting additive, and I'm not sure, tasting the beer, if I pick up on anything that's rye. I don't know if I'm getting any of it.
I'll just say, I mean, something else that you had mentioned previously were the different dregs that went to this beer, right?
Oh, yeah.
And many of those beers were, your classic sour saisons or mixed culture saisons. And what's a component in many saisons? Rye.
Yeah, totally.
So that could be it. Maybe that was the original intention. They decided to throw raspberries on it, and now it's some amalgamation of multiple styles, which is why it's so difficult for them to kind of figure out where to put it.
Right. And I find that rye really complements Brett both ways. So it seems like that possibly been the intention on this one. It comes together pretty nicely.
I think the beer is actually really nice. Mine's maybe slightly undercarbonated. Could probably use a little bit more effervescence, carbonation, but taste,
mine as well. Yeah,
really great raspberry character to it, and I like how the sort of barnyard funk is sort of in there a little bit. It's a pretty good beer. I think it's nice.
Yeah.
It's pretty pungent, I have to say. I find it a little offensive for me personally.
That's my style.
I know it is.
I do like those offensive beers.
You like the extremes. For me, I find it a little too much. I mean, I don't mind a little bit of it, but it's pretty high. It's moderately high, that Barnyard Funk, which is, I think, kind of throwing off the raspberries. I mean, I guess when I think of a fruit beer, I think of kind of that bright acidity and the fruity floral notes and kind of that perceived sweetness. And then you throw in like the Barnyard Funk, and it now becomes almost like a rotten fruit component a little bit. So that's my only minor complaint. And also the carbonation, it's pretty low carbonation overall. But I do like the raspberry component. I like everything else about the beer. The tartness, the sourness works really well with the raspberries. Obviously, it's not too tart. I think that's the right amount of acidity. So I think, other than that really strong Barnyard Funk, I think it's a pretty successful beer.
So let's assume he sent this to us and told us it was going to be 28C. When you're judging that category, I'm curious about this. When you're judging that category, you must be tapping into the memory banks of a beer that you've had that sort of fits this criteria, right? You're automatically trying to compare it to something because it's going to be it's a wild specialty beer. It's going to be something unique. So you're probably thinking, okay, the description I have says it's a raspberry beer that, let's pretend that he called it a Flanders. You're probably going into your bank saying, have I ever had a raspberry Flanders beer, and trying to compare it to something, right?
Yeah, and I mean, this is, like I said, sort of a catch-all category, but I do have to say there are commercial examples. So you can look at the end of the guidelines and kind of get an idea about what you're going for. And I'm looking at it now, and there's quite a few kind of fruit sour beers. So that's what I'd be comparing it to kind of get an idea. Even if you weren't familiar with the commercial beers, you could still kind of get an idea about the balance of the beer. At the end of the day, you want a balanced beer between all the different components to make it, taste good.
Awesome. So, all right. So one more time, we're assuming 28C.
Yep.
We want to be fair to everybody. We've given them the category. Give us an overall impression of the beer and drop a score on us.
Yeah, so I think it's a pretty well executed beer. The raspberries and the acidity work really well together. My knocks to it would be carbonation, and I do think that Barnyard Funk is probably too high. Off the top of my head, if I had to give it a score for 28C, it would probably get a 32.
Yeah, I was in my head thinking the same thing, around 30. Yeah, the carbonation is pretty low. I mean, the flavors are great. The raspberry seems to overpower the Barnyard Funk in the beginning for me, but then coming through in the end, it kind of really overpowers it. Just exhaling, it's kind of like all up in my nose and olfactory. It's pretty powerful, but around the same.
All right, guys. Well, thank you. That was a bit different. To our listeners out there, send us some feedback on this. This is the first time we've done this little different twist on our judging segment. If this is like something you'd like us to do maybe in the future, leave us a comment or hit us up on social media. All right, and now time for the main event. Joining us this week is Joe, who we affectionately call within the club Mr. Lactose, and there's a bit of a reason for it. Joe is the most prolific user of lactose in our club, but he's also mastered it more than probably anybody else, and not to excess. Not like those milkshake IPAs and pastry stouts, though Joe is known to do those. Joe will use it to an extent that brings out the best of the beer. He probably hates the name. Joe, do you hate the name?
I'm starting to like it. Okay.
But
I hated it in the beginning, and now it's kind of like Mr. Lactose is here, baby. Like that's it.
You got to own it.
I got to get the tattoo soon.
So you have earned it. So Joe, let's start with some of the basics.
I'm going to try really hard, Joe, to be as engaged as possible in this conversation about fucking lactose. And I know you just sat through basically a shitting on these beers. So take us from the beginning. You do make some really great beer. I don't mean to give you a hard time all the time, but the beers that you make are great. I sometimes question the use of lactose, but when you do it well. Why don't you tell us first, not where it started in beer, but where it started for you? Talk to us about like what inspired you to want to use this ingredient and start making some beers with it.
So the first time I used lactose was probably 2016, I'm guessing, and I wanted it.
Wait, are you the pioneer of lactose beers?
I made it in 2016. So I wanted to, I think it was right around the time hearing about milkshake IPAs with like Omni Polo and Tired Hands. And I said, that sounds awesome. Like, I really wanted to make kind of like a creamsicle kind of flavored beer, the lactose being the milk sugar, to add that creamy flavor to it, and using hops, get those same like orangey type flavors. So I made to make the Milkshake IPA, and there was really no guide out there on how much to use in a Milkshake IPA. So it kind of just winged it. Made my first Milkshake IPA with, like a pound of lactose in a 5-gallon batch, and just went from there. And, like the first batch was okay. It wasn't what I envisioned it to be, but that was kind of my first attempt at it. And then just kept going from there, making, tweaks to my recipe, and, adding more, sometimes more would be, chalky, pretty much until I tweaked my recipes and got it into what I thought was an appropriate amount that was, palatable, and tasted what I had envisioned in my head as like a Milkshake IPA, because really not many people were making them.
Yeah, you actually bring up something kind of interesting. Obviously when breweries, like somebody who doesn't make beer probably isn't going to take the time to understand or figure out why a Milkshake IPA is called a Milkshake IPA, but you being a brewer did that, right? For that person that loves beer and is maybe thinking about getting into home brewing, or that home brewer that's just started off that's thinking about making these types of beers, first thing is, what are the indicators that tell you that a beer has lactose? Nobody's calling a beer a lactose stout or a lactose IPA. So what are the indicators that are telling you, hey, this beer has lactose in it?
I mean, generally, you're going to get it off on your palate first. If someone's using a ton of lactose in the beer, you're more likely going to taste it. It's going to have a little bit of chalkiness to it. If they're making the beer right, you shouldn't know it's in there at all. You might not know there's lactose in the beer if they're using it in the right portions. Going overboard is just really going to, you're going to taste that just kind of chalky sweetness. Lactose generally only has I believe a 15% perceived sweetness as like table sugar. So it's really not, even if they go kind of overboard, you might not get a really sweet beer, but you're going to notice it in your palate. It's going to be more full bodied. It's going to be creamy, like not so much creamy, but it's going to be just like a thicker beer. It's going to have a lot more body, sometimes not with the same amount of sweetness. It's really kind of like some used as like a thickening agent in, say, baking.
Is that where like milk stout comes in?
Definitely. So if you think about one of the biggest ones, left-hand milk stout, one of the first, say, American beers using the style, they're going to be using that lactose to increase the body, as some of these beers may not have as much alcohol, say like your standard stout. The lactose is going to give it even more body. It's going to add that sweetness to the beer to help bring it all together.
Yeah. So a milk stout is a pretty recognizable style. Milkshake IPA is not so much today, but why are people using lactose? Like, what's the purpose of lactose in beer?
The purpose of lactose in the beer is just to add more sweetness, add more body, just round out the beer. When you're using, say, even a higher alcohol beer, if it doesn't have as much sugar, it's going to be completely unbalanced. So it's another way to balance out the beer. Say you have a stout that's extremely, like, say, bitter. The sweetness is going to help balance and round it out. So it can be used in a variety of situations. So you have a thin beer, the lactose is going to help increase the body. You have a very alcoholic beer, the sweetness is going to help round out the alcohol. So it can be used there's a lot of reasons to use it. And it depends on what say, the base beer.
So Joe, when you're creating one of your infamous Milkshake IPAs or your pastry stouts, how are you determining how much lactose to use, when to use it, what flavor characteristics you're hoping to impart by using it in whatever process you're choosing? Like, how are you getting there?
Based off of all the different IPAs I've tried, all the different, trial and errors, say, for those beers, kind of my rule of thumb for lactose in beer is generally around, say, a pound per 5-gallon batch. So about 3 ounces per gallon is what I found to be enough to add the body, retain sweetness, and not overpower the beer with a really chalky flavor. Almost it's there, but it's not. You're not going to notice it unless you're really looking for it. Generally, so for what I am looking for out of lactose is to add a creamy mouthfeel, body, in case say the yeast goes nuts and really dries out the like say the IPA, milkshake IPA, because I'm sure we've all had it ourselves where the yeast can just plow through all those fermentable sugars and you end up with a really dry, bitter hot bomb. That's not what you're looking for. So adding the lactose for those beers is really helping make sure that the sweetness is going to retain that beer and the body and the balance is going to be in the beer. So generally you're going to be adding the lactose in the last 15 minutes of the boil. You can also add the lactose later on in your beer. Say your beer does come out drier than you want it to be, and you really want to boost up that body, you can be adding lactose to your fermenter or your finished beer. Just make sure you want to be mixing it either with water. Sometimes you can mix it back with like a portion of the beer, but make sure you at least pasteurize it or boil it to make sure you're not introducing any bugs to your beer to add it back in there. And just because the lactose is non-fermentable, you're not going to be worrying about creating any bottle bombs or getting a re-fermentation started there.
I just want to make sure that we're clear for folks that are listening to this. You're not suggesting using lactose necessarily to fix issues with beer. Like if you're making a Hefeweizen that is drying out too much, you're not saying add lactose to get more body to it. This is part of recipe design. You want to impart a lactose character in a beer, which is why you're using it.
What I'm saying is you could do both. Generally, I'm using lactose in my recipe when I'm starting out. I know I'm making a milkshake IPA or I'm making a milk stout, any type of adjunct, but it could be used. Say I made a beer, it might not be my go-to item if I wanted to increase the body to a finished beer. I might go with maltodextrin instead because I don't generally want that creaminess or milk, sugar flavor to a Hefeweizen. I probably wouldn't do that. I would go with either like maltodextrin or even try to add some minerals to my water to have a perceived sweetness to the beer. But in theory, it could be done on a Hefeweizen. You could add a creaminess to it.
But in that example, it's something you would have to plan out on brew day. It's not something you're going to do post fermentation to try and fix a problem.
And wait, let me just say right now, that's a good thing that the doc isn't with us for this segment, because if he heard anybody fucking talking about adding lactose to a Hefeweizen, he might stab somebody. He's got to be somewhere really far away. I'm actually afraid for when he listens to this episode that the emails and messages we're going to get from him about how dare you guys share stupid shit like putting lactose in the Hefeweizen.
I'm not saying that it should be done. I'm saying it can be done.
I mean, you can put lactose in anything.
I'm going to channel my inner Nick Greiner, and you would be wrong, Joe.
Okay, sure. It can be used to add body back to the beer. It can add sweetness. It's not going to re-ferment. It can be done. I'm not doing that. I have not done that. I've only ever fixed the beer with maltodextrin, but it could be done in theory. I'm all thrown off now.
All right, sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
We all are, yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. So, Phil, I mean, I think that's good advice on, how to think about lactose in a beer, especially, again, this is the biggest trend that we're seeing in the beer industry between fruited sours, milkshake IPAs, pastry stouts. But is there a point where it becomes too much? Can you go overboard with lactose?
100%. I'm sure you've all probably tasted it in a beer where it was so cloyingly sweet and chalky that it becomes not enjoyable. I mean, there's been plenty of times where I've gone to a brewery, I won't mention names, by that just one sip, she doesn't know what lactose tastes, but she picked it off right away, saying like how chalky and sweet it was, and that's 100% agreed that it was in the beer that she just couldn't even finish. So generally, I wouldn't go over threshold would be 2 pounds in a 5-gallon batch. So let's say 6 ounces per gallon is is a lot. That's kind of the upper threshold. And, I just stick to, 3 ounces per gallon is kind of going to get you that sweet spot where you might not notice it there. It's just going to be adding that certain level of sweetness and creaminess that the beer is asking for that style, that milkshake or milk stout. Otherwise, it can get chalky and super sweet really quick.
Joe, what's the largest batch lactose beer you've made?
So it's what I'm drinking right now as a 1-barrel batch of Imperial Milk Stout.
So does that formula scale up 3 ounces to gallon?
That's what we did on this one, yeah.
Yeah, because I know with hops, it doesn't quite scale up like that. The math is a little bit different as you get. Malt does, but hops don't. So I was curious about if that 3 ounce, like for folks that are on a spike system at 20 gallons, or somebody that's on a pot in their kitchen table doing 5 gallons, if it's scaled that way.
Based off what I'm drinking right here, it does have the same body and what I expect of my normal, say, milk stout on a 5-gallon batch. As we really kind of stuck to that formula, and it's not chalky. It does have sweetness, but I think we really needed it on this batch. For an Imperial Stout with a, say, higher bitterness level, we kind of really wanted to make sure that beer wasn't going to be unbalanced. So we, went with the same level of lactose, and had our higher hopping rate for a Imperial Stout, and it worked out really well, especially on this 1-barrel batch.
So Joe, if you are a brewer who's, say, a newer brewer, wants to, say, brew just a standard milk stout like you were just talking, and they've never used lactose ever before, and I know you just said 3 ounce per gallon, but let's talk about, where would you get started in your recipe formulation for, do you just put together a standard stout recipe and then go 3 ounces times 5, put it in the last 15 minutes of the boil? Is it that simple? Where would you go in that recipe formulation if you were going to be a new brewer, new to lactose?
So if you're a newer brewer, I would definitely research a lot of recipes first, because if you were just to make a standard stout and you take a standard stout recipe and throw in, say, a pound of lactose, you might end up with a beer that's way too sweet and unbalanced. So you might be ending with some residual sugars, and there's no need to add on more. So you want to look into a standard 5-gallon milk stout recipe before you're just taking a stout recipe and say, hey, I just want to add lactose to this. You want to make sure your end product is balanced and not overly sweet. Generally, a milk stout is a little sweeter, but you don't want to end up with a extremely cloyingly sweet product. So I think what has helped me through my entire brewing career is just researching recipes and seeing what is out there, how much is appropriate, what are the balance in different base malts and roasted malts plus lactose, before you just to go aside and throw lactose in a batch just because you want to make it a milk stout.
You brought up an interesting point there where you may end up with a little residual sweetness and fermentation of a stout to begin with. So I would think that you would almost want to kind of have a little bit of experience with whatever yeast you're going to use, maybe a version of said recipe, and your fermentation equipment, your brewing equipment, so that you know how, say, all of that plays together with fermentation. Do you finish a little low? Do you finish a little high before you start adding lactose? I mean, you don't want to just make this your first batch.
Right. I agree with you there. This trying to make an extreme style of beer as your first batch is never going to go well for anyone. I know from example, my first batch of all grain was a double IPA and a winter warmer on the first batch, trying to make something that was just really like high ABV, strong, and it was a really long bad brew day, and the beers didn't come out great. So if you're a new brewer, I wouldn't suggest going all out. Don't go big on your first few batches. Really try to focus on the basics of brewing. Make a good beer first before you think throwing lactose is just going to fix the problem or just make it good. Just because it's sweet doesn't make it a good beer.
On that, I have a series of IPAs that I do, and I just I number every one of them. And number 16 or 18 of them, I tried to make a milkshake IPA, and you've had it, and it was total freaking garbage. And so even after 16, 18 rounds of that IPA and over 100 batches of beer up to that point, even I couldn't figure out lactose. So it's not exactly, I would say it's something that you're not going to nail it the first time. There is a little of experimentation involved.
I agree. I mean, one thing is less is more. You can always add more in your next batch if you don't think it's enough. You can't take it out of the beer. It's one thing I kind of work with most of my recipes. If I'm adding an ingredient that I'm not sure exactly what my proportions are to begin with, I won't just add a ton of it. I can always create another beer. This beer isn't going to go bad. You can drink it all and just go on to the next one. So don't worry, relax, have a homebrew.
That's a good sentiment to kind of finish up for the day. Relax always. Don't worry, have a homebrew, and lactose in moderation, which, Joe, I think that is why you are Mr. Lactose, because your beers are lactose in moderation. Sometimes we wouldn't know you put lactose in the beer unless you had told us. So
yeah, this topic makes Joe a pretty easy target for us. But as I mentioned a little bit earlier, Joe, the beers that you make are pretty outstanding. You do some really great stuff. You're definitely recognized as one of the better brewers in the club, and you are the first brewer of the year in the club, so your name is on the trophy. Nobody can be above your name on that trophy. So you are the first honcho on there. So thanks for joining us. Really great stuff. I think we're going to see you back in a couple of weeks, so appreciate the time with you.
All right, thank you.
Well, thanks to Nick and Joe for joining us this week. And as always, if you like what you heard, make sure you hit that subscribe button or leave us a review. Next week on the show, we have an epic tasting battle of English bitters. And joining us to talk about his start into home brewing is Brett Bauer, who used to be the lead brewer at Idle Hands in Malden and at Heaven and Ale in Tennessee. It's going to be an awesome show, so we'll see you next time on Strike, Mash, Boil. The Strike, Mash, Boil podcast is produced by the Merrimack Valley Homebrew Club, an American Homebrewers Association sanctioned club. Follow us on Instagram at MVHBC. Join the conversation in our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/MVHBC. And check out our website at mvhbc.com.
Mr. Lactose is here, baby. Like that. That's it.
You got to own it.
I got to get the tattoo soon.
Joe, is that when you enter the bedroom with your Mr. Lactose is here? Is that what you do?
You know it.
That's your entry.
Yeah.
We'll get some music for you. That'd be great.